you so much for coming. I'd like to say thanks so much to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak today. And just before I go into the talk per se, I just wanted to read out a statement that has been developed by the School of Education, University of Glasgow. And this is as a consequence of a 2021 report entitled Understanding Racism and Transforming University Cultures. And the school, in response, have done a number of initiatives, and the statement, we hope, is reflecting the school's commitment to social justice and anti-racism work. So I'll just read this out first. The University of Glasgow acknowledges that during the 18th and 19th centuries, it received some gifts and bequests from persons who may have benefited from the proceeds of slavery. Income from such gifts and bequests has been used in supporting academic activity undertaken by the students and staff of the university. This acknowledgement is not simply an apology for what has happened in the past, but to recognize and raise awareness about how racial slavery and the history of colonialism have led to the university's development and accumulation of wealth. Through this statement, we reaffirm our commitment to reparative justice through actions designed to decolonize the curriculum. Okay, so as you've heard, my talk really is looking at issues of diversity in terms of academic staff in higher education. And I've put in pandemic times. I'm not sure whether we're post-pandemic, in the middle of another pandemic, I'm not quite sure. But I've tried to bring the most recent figures as possible and to think about how the pandemic has complicated the issues that I'm going to be talking about. And to start off with, I just wanted to talk briefly about the term diversity itself. Obviously, the term diversity in general means a sort of a plethora of variation of characteristics or facets. And in terms of diversity in higher education, obviously at one level we're meaning a diversity of the backgrounds and dimensions of diversity such as gender, race and ethnicity, disability, and so on, in terms of the individuals that make up the academic workforce. But a number of colleagues since the 90s have really critiqued the notion of diversity, noting how it can often be used to perhaps make a friendlier, more benign conception of any change that needs to be made, as opposed to perhaps more critical notions like equality, equity, anti-racism, and so on. And it's possible, of course, to have diversity just as a tick box exercise that actually means that you might have some numerical diversity, but the actual ability of departments or institutions to benefit from those people in terms of diversifying the curriculum or management practices, cultures and practices in the academy, perhaps that is harder to achieve. So that's something that I very much wanted to focus on, the notion of cultural diversity when I'm talking here, not just the numbers, although, of course, we need a certain amount of statistical information in order to proceed as well. Now, a recent report by Claes Kulik and colleagues has talked about how there is a large commitment across many European higher education institutions to diversity, But how this is conceptualized and what figures are actually collected by institutions is another matter. They did a report on 159 universities across the EU. And it seems like for most of the institutions, it's only figures relating to gender and to a slightly lesser extent disability that often get collected when people are getting data around their academic staff. And characteristics of diversity such as race and ethnicity, sexuality, and so on are much rarer for institutions to collect this. And I know in some EU countries it's actually illegal to collect data on race and ethnicity. But that, of course, then makes it harder for us to really see the picture of what's going on in institutions. But we do have, in terms of gender, which is the area that I tend to specialize in and have most information on, we do have the SHE figures, which is a really great resource published every few years by the European Commission. And they give figures on gender. So we can see here that at the European level, women represented more than 40% of academic staff on average across institutions. However, when we go up the academic ladder and look at what they've called grade A positions, which is like the equivalent of a full professorship, it's about just over a quarter of these positions are held by women overall. And women make up less than 25% of heads of higher education institutions across Europe in 2019. And of course, that really masks a lot of variation across the disciplines as well, and of course in different countries. I've got a bit more statistics in relation to the UK. These are the latest from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and we do collect data on race and ethnicity in the UK. So we can see here in the UK, women from 20 to 21 held 48% of academic positions overall, but 30% of full professorships. And for academics where ethnicity was known, we can see that the figures are starker. We have only 20% of academics of known ethnicity from ethnic minority backgrounds. And ECER note that that's an increase from 16% in 2017 to 18. And when we look at the professorships, it's only 12%. So, of course, this is a very pressing issue. And one thing I wanted to note, of course, in relation to the statistics is that we have to obviously be careful of them. One of the things we can do is fall into a trap whereby we're treating these figures as representing the truth about people, that we can lump people into these very simple categories. For example, lumping women and men together in these uncomplicated and oppositional categories, which leaves aside obviously the more complex variations in the ways in which people identify in relation to gender. And of course, it also simplifies the ways in which we actually experience our lives, as including experience relating to a multiplicity of our identities or positionings at any one time. And the intersectional aspects of our actual experience can get lost when we're looking at these very broad brush figures. And there is also a danger as well that we can focus a little bit too much at the level of the individual. How do we get individual women or individual ethnic minority academics into university or into STEM disciplines and so on. Whereas what we also really need to make sure we have a huge focus on is the workings of broader institutional and social cultures and how we can change those. And it's these broader cultural patterns and influences that I wanted to focus on in this talk. So obviously the lack of diversity or the problems with diversity that we can see across European higher education, and of course in many other contexts as well, means that there is a lack of diversity in terms of academic knowledge production, who's in the more senior positions, the more stable and secure positions, and are therefore able to contribute to the knowledge that gets generated in the university and that then gets circulated and taught. And writers such as Cavagan and Kulovic and Moore and colleagues have discussed how in the 21st century we see the increasing importance of knowledge production as part of a global knowledge economy. And of course, academia is a key part of this. And Louise Morley has written how knowledge is increasingly presented as a form of capital for nations, especially to invest in. And to quote, as such, it is a site of contestation, inclusions, exclusions, and maldistributions. Now, there's a strong tradition of work by feminist scholars, scholars on race and other dimensions of diversity, pointing out the ways in which the knowledge that has historically been constructed and circulated by universities has very much been gendered, raced, and classed. A lot of work has explored the ways in which dominant constructions of the academic reflect the sort of historical beginnings of the university still, and still in some ways implicitly in society in general. The picture of the academic is still someone who is white, who is male, who is of a more privileged social background. And as reflected in some of our cultures and practices, there is a conception that the academic will be someone who does not have direct caring commitments or has someone to look after that for them, so that we can burn the midnight oil without and get on with the important work. So there is therefore a lot of challenge, and I'm not doing justice to the raft of scholarship on this. I would love to talk further with people on this. But there is a huge challenge that has that arises when we think about diversifying the knowledge producers in the academy, in that we have to get over some of these very entrenched, long-standing and long-enduring cultural discourses. And including the conception that if knowledge is authored or constructed by people from, in some ways, positions other to the traditional conception of the academic, then in some ways there is there can be question marks as to the legitimacy and the full validity of that form of knowledge. I wanted to give you a quote from Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote back in 1990 about this in relation to Black feminist thought. Reclaiming the Black feminist intellectual tradition involves much more than developing Black feminist analysis using standard or traditional epistemological criteria. It also involves challenging the very definitions of intellectual discourse. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in relation to this. This is the picture that we have even before we then go on to look at some of the other dynamics that I'm going to talk about. One that is something I've done quite a lot of work on in recent years and is dear to my heart, which is the issue of social precarity in academia. And as I'm sure all of you know, the term social precarity is usually used in academic analysis in relation to employment. So any employment that's not permanent or full-time. So it encompasses a wide range of contracts from sort of fixed-term contracts, hourly paid contracts, 0 hours contracts where you're not even guaranteed any hours of work, and so on, and of course part-time contracts as well. And I've actually been using a concept of precarity that's actually a little broader and doesn't just need to focus on employment precarity, and that's from the work of Judith Butler. And Judith Butler uses the term social precarity to refer to any forms of insecurity. So it could be, for example, issues to do with housing, or she's looked at it in relation to fears around terrorism and so on. And she uses the term to talk about any forms or feelings of precariousness that are not simply the product of accident. So, for example, obviously slipping on an icy pavement or a wet pavement in terms of Glasgow. And but what she is looking at is the forms of precarity that are connected to or indeed induced by wider socio-political forces. And of course, that would mean, for example, people who are moved on to a 0 hours contract as part of a wider marketized neoliberal regime in the academy. And a key thing for Judith Butler is that to keep in mind that obviously social precarity can be experienced by a wide range of people, but it's more likely to be felt and felt more severely by those who are already in less advantaged groups or less advantaged positions in society. So what does this mean in terms of the academic workforce? Well, some people have said that obviously we can't use the term to look at the academic workforce in the same way because academics are in many ways a relatively privileged group, despite a relative loss of status in many countries in recent decades. So we have to obviously look at these issues in relation to relative privilege in terms of academia. But of course, in many countries in the global south as well, higher education has often been an insecure, very precarious place to work in contrast to countries in the global north. But even in the richest countries of the global north, we've seen a marked increase in what's called the casualization of labor in academia, badly affecting support and administrative staff, as well as, of course, academic staff as well. I've got some figures from the UK to show you. And this is from a 2021 report, Precarity in Higher Education. And they have published that a third of academic staff based in 2021 are on fixed-term contracts. And you can see that varies according to the type of contract that you have. If you look at the research-only positions, that rises to 68% of people in research-only positions being on fixed-term contracts. So that, of course, has a real knock-on effect as to who's able to produce knowledge. And other countries are higher. I actually am part of a network called the Gender and Precarity in Europe network. And that includes a number of academics from across Europe. It's part of the European Universities Critical Futures project funded by the Danish Funding Council. And as part of that, we're developing a working paper, and one of my colleagues there, Marie Sautier, notes that, for example, in Switzerland, precarious employment has become the norm in the Swiss public research system, with close to 80% of researchers working under short-term employment conditions. And it's not really surprising to then go on to look, when we look at who are in these precarious positions, that it is disproportionately those who are already in some ways seen as other in the academy. Again, I've got some figures from the UK. This is, again, from 2021. We can see that the top figure has broken down the percentage of women and the percentage of men on fixed-term contracts in academia, 35% versus 32%. And the figures get really stark when you look at race and ethnicity. We have 30% of white academic staff on fixed-term contracts. That rises to 40% of black academic staff and 43% of Asian academic staff. And there's obviously a strong qualitative effect on people's experience of being an academic if you find yourself on a fixed-term contract. And this can range from the anxieties that we can obviously imagine if we're not on these contracts right now, the anxieties of having a lack of regular or dependable income, and the insecurity about not knowing whether your contract's going to be renewed. There's also, in the literature on this, there's a lot of evidence to show that staff on precarious contracts are not able to make full use of the capacity building and development opportunities of permanent academics. And there is a more sort of nebulous, hard to pin down, but nevertheless very insidious feeling that they may be perceived by staff and other students as in some ways less than or not fully part of the academic community. And crucially for this talk, there is a big impact in relation to, if you're on a precarious contract, about whether you can really do your own research, contribute to the generation of knowledge in the academy. I just wanted to give you a quick quote from one of the participants in a study that Carol Leithwood and I did it with precarious academic staff. And this is Pippa, obviously a pseudonym, talking. She's now a senior lecturer, but she, until very recently, at the time, she had been on an insecure contract. And she says, a part-time hourly paid worker only gets paid for the actual hours worked. And so Christmas, Easter, and summer are unpaid. There's no time to write or publish because she, the worker, has to try to find work during these unpaid months. This ends up being almost half of the year when you add it all up. Such stress and anxiety also means that you cannot do your job very well. In my first year as a teacher, I had insomnia and panic attacks. So you can see, therefore, that there's a direct relation between the type of contract that you're on and then your ability to really fully be part of any diverse knowledge production in the academy. And of course, COVID-19 has just exacerbated the issue. There's been quite a bit of recent reporting that has shown that pre-existing inequalities have just been compounded by the effects of the pandemic. A number of studies have looked at the detrimental effect of lockdowns on academics with caring commitments, particularly those with children under 12. And as we know, this disproportionately affects women parents and women guardians. There's a report from Australia that I found very helpful. The Rapid Research Information Forum report was published in 2020, and it was looking particularly at the STEM workforce in Australia. And this report noted that women in STEM in Australia were disproportionately affected in terms of job losses due to COVID and the aftermath. And also, they were also disproportionately affected by needing to take on teaching that was done by casualised staff who were then let go. I can see a few nods in the audience here. And also developing in the online materials that we had to do very quickly during COVID. And there's also a number of studies that have shown that there has been a gender gap, and I'm not sure whether that has reduced yet in terms of publishing manuscripts sent to academic journals, applying for funding, applying for sabbaticals, and so on. A lot of this then was reduced, especially by women academics and other caregivers during the pandemic. And in Europe, a European Commission Joint Research Centre report 2020 showed that women academics felt more pressure to reduce their work because of their commitments or even resign. So there's a big issue here that was highlighted in the pandemic. And I just wanted to show you quickly an article that was published in the Times Higher in the UK in May 2020, and it was authored by 35 women scientists who are working on, or were at the time working on COVID-19 research. And they said, even lifelong battles for a place in science have left us unprepared for the gendered and racial inequalities we have experienced in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they pointed to things like the what's called the productivity divide in terms of publications and so on, and caring responsibilities. But they also noted that women and black minority ethnic scientists were chosen far less often to speak to media or to be brought on as experts by the media during the pandemic as well. So STEM disciplines haven't been the hardest hit as far as we can tell in terms of academic job losses or threats since the pandemic, where the threatened or actual job losses seem to have been focused particularly on the arts, humanities and languages. There's a paper by Adsit and colleagues who note that in times of adversity, STEM departments are more likely to be spared, whilst arts and humanities are more likely to have job losses. This is in the US, but we can see some patterns across the globe. And the reasons that are usually given for job losses in these disciplines is about profit and commercial viability. But there is also, I think, a hangover in relation to status and prestige, in that the disciplines that are constructed as the most masculinized are also the ones that are socially most valued. And together with attracting funding from industry means that we definitely see institutional an unevenness in the ways in which precarity is experienced across the disciplines. But even within STEM, it's the casualised staff that are most likely to lose out in times of adversity. And we know that it's there that we see the greater concentrations of women and minority ethnic staff. So a number of writers have talked about how there's a direct connection then between social precarity and academic freedom, the freedom to be able to produce knowledge and to be part of that academic conversation. This is a definition by Karen and Mallinson about academic freedom, contrasting with a definition for freedom of speech. And academic freedom, according to Karen and Mallinson, is a professional freedom granted to a few, chosen on the basis of their professional competence, and related to what's called their accredited expertise. So it's a very different fish from the general notion of free speech. And in her book on academic freedom, Joan Scott directly relates the rise of a casualized workforce with an increased precarity of academic freedom. Karen and Mallinson did a report in 2017 for the Universities and Colleges Union in the UK, and they actually compared data from the UCU members in the UK, the union members, with 4,000 staff in universities in EU countries. And they found that, I won't go through all the figures there, but they found that a significant percentage of EU respondents and even more respondents in the UK reported being bullied, being subjected to psychological pressure, and having experienced self-censorship for fear of negative repercussions. So obviously these affects then the ability to really produce the sorts of knowledge that people want to in the academy. And Blell and colleagues argue that there are two dimensions to the ways in which precarity particularly can limit academic freedom. Firstly, that if you're on a precarious contract, you feel a need a little bit more to toe the line, not rock the boat, and because you're relying on networks of goodwill, permanent or senior colleagues that can perhaps help you secure your next employment or maybe permanent employment. And this reminds me of a recent study by Hoskins, Moreau and Hugh that looked at the transition of PhD students into academia and talked about the importance of the supervisors, the supervisory team that people have, and how this can work positively and negatively in very gendered, raced and classed ways. And that they argue that that's a real importance for having a diversity of academic staff if that is having an effect on the networks that people join. We can also argue about whether they should have an effect, but there is definitely, there seems to be a sort of pattern in terms of you are more likely to be helped by your supervisors into academia if in some way you have factors in common with them in terms of perhaps race, gender and ethnicity. So I think that sort of shows up another angle that we need to be thinking about. And the second dimension that they talk about are psychic limitations. And these are fears about how your words will be received by others if you are coming already from an othered position. And they say even in more secure positions, gender and ethnic minorities who speak critically experience a backlash or are perceived as troublemakers. Women of color academics must already develop strategies for survival and success in a space dominated by masculinity and whiteness. And this is exacerbated by conditions of job precarity faced disproportionately by women and people of color. So obviously then precarity adds an extra dimension when we're thinking about how we can attain real diversity in academia. And academic freedom disproportionately is affected by those who are on precarious contracts. And I just wanted to finish up by also looking at another sort of strand of social forces that are having an impact on academic freedom, and that's the dynamic of the challenges from the political right, especially the far right and right-wing populist strands that are attacking the university in general and some forms of knowledge in particular. So there's a lot of work on this which I can't do justice to at all here, but there's obviously a variety of different strands and of thought that are that I've lumped together in this sort of ultra-conservative, right-wing populist movements. And they can have very differing positions on how they see academic knowledge. But one positioning, obviously, I think we're all familiar with, is the notion that there are a group of left-behind people that have been left behind by the perceived elites. And this includes, obviously, university elites. But there's also a variety of ways in which these different movements have views on aspects of diversity such as gender and race ethnicity. For example, in some iterations of right-wing thought, the notion of women's rights and gay and lesbian rights have been taken up by some movements, but often as a means to make a distinction between what they construct to be the civilized West as opposed to the repressive East, especially in terms of Islam. And there's a good paper on this by Delange, who notes that gender ideologies in these different right-wing movements across Europe often construct gender as a product of natural differences between the sexes, with a particular focus on women's roles as mothers and within the family as something that needs to be protected. And because they're the mothers of the nation. And of course, this echoes nationalist rhetoric that back to colonial times. And Delange argues that there's a definite pattern whereby some of these proponents of these alternative gender knowledges, as I should put it, that they are attempting to challenge the legitimacy of academic gender knowledges, especially social constructionist and post-structuralist feminism, queer studies and transgender studies. And there's also, as we've seen, there's been a huge backlash, ongoing backlash against critical race theory in many right-wing quarters that attempts to turn the tables and say that critical race theorists are anti-democratic, damaging race relations, and so on, just as the feminist research is sometimes characterized as being not true science because it's ideology as opposed to the truth. So there's a sort of what Delange calls a sort of epistemic battle going on in terms of these attacks. And Petu also discusses the influence of anti-gender studies movements in Hungary. In a paper entitled Academic Freedom in Gender Studies, an Alliance Forged in Fire, she looks at the 2018 revoking by the Hungarian government of the license for a master's program in gender studies. as well as the eventual need for the Central European University to leave Hungary and relocate to Vienna. And in regards to the Gender Studies MA, she notes that excuses around economics were first given. Again, the sort of neoliberal argument that sees students as consumers, and well, there's no interest or demand for this subject, so therefore we need to cull it. And then she said this was then replaced by argument saying that, well, there's no need for graduates with these skills in the labour market. Again, quite a neoliberal position. And then moving on to the explanation that the gender studies program was incompatible with Christian values. Yes. So, and as I've mentioned, there's often a positioning of such attacks as being levied in the name of objectivity, and the forms of knowledge that they're critiquing, those are the ones that are unscientific. And this is, of course, an issue for transgender knowledge as well. So this is Ruth Pearce, who argues that trans and pro-trans scholars and students do face a threat to our academic freedom from those who subject us to hate speech or actual violence. If we're afraid to speak out or have to adapt research to minimize harassment, we're not truly free to undertake our studies. So there's a lot of mixture of sort of like neoliberal arguments and then some explicitly political and even fundamentalist religious arguments against some of the forms of academic knowledge making by people who have traditionally been seen as other in the academy. And there's obviously a big critique about this by academics. Joan Scott notes that we can't bank on academic freedom if we purely see the value of academic knowledge as an economic factor. The value of, if we see the value of courses only in terms of fee income, the ability to attract industry funding or partnership, or in relation to graduate earnings. And there's been rhetoric in the UK about this as well, judging courses in relation to graduate outcomes. And Laurie Allen notes, although this is not a direct attack on academic freedom, it does provide universities an incentive to bring in certain kinds of students and give them a certain kind of entrepreneurialism-focused education. So there's a creeping attempt then to influence what sort of knowledges are produced and circulated in the academy. We've seen that there is a disproportionate vulnerability of the arts and humanities, the languages, and perhaps the social sciences as well, towards closure and censure. And even if they're not explicitly motivated by anti-equity concerns, then this can be the result. As we've seen, these are the subject areas that are more likely to have women and minority ethnic academic staff in them. They are, these staff across the board are more likely to be on precarious contracts, and therefore most vulnerable when universities need to make cutbacks. And this creates then extra pressures on staff that are already marginalized. So I'll just finish off with another quotation by Bloel, who say, given the post-truth times and culture wars in which we find ourselves, it's apparent that historically excluded and minoritized academics face new risks and greater pressures, building on already deep-rooted institutional cultures of targeted silencing. So in conclusion then, I have been talking a little bit about how we have a problem with diversity in the academy across many countries in the globe, I've given some examples from Europe. And we have a number of social forces that are particularly important to look at. The dynamic of social precarity is something that I think we can't tackle things like getting more women academics into STEM and so on unless we tackle the issue of the precarity in the academic workforce. I've talked briefly about the other attacks from the sort of social areas of right-wing movements, ultra-right-wing movements, and how that has had an effect. You can see in the US as well, it's ramping up attacks on gender and race knowledge by DeSantis and others, and I think it's something that we can't think this won't happen in our countries, you know. And we need to be thinking about this. And obviously in these post-pandemic times, we have seen an intensification of some of these pre-existing inequalities due to COVID. It's a lot for us to think about, but I think that these things need to be looked at holistically, and to bringing in these wider social aspects, as well as focusing on what we can do for individuals and what we can do at institutional level. We need to perhaps see these picture in the round. I'll leave it there, but thank you so much for listening.